The crimson emergency light bathed the transport bay in an eerie glow as Avery Chin stared at the control panel in horror. Her fingers still hovered over the button she'd accidentally pressed, the one clearly labeled Combat Deployment in 3 different languages. No, 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 she whispered, frantically trying to reverse the command. But the safety protocols had already engaged. The massive doors of Transport Pod 7 hissed shut behind her, sealing her inside with 24 actual soldiers who were now staring at the civilian engineer in her lab coat. James Rodriguez, a grizzled sergeant with more scars than smile lines, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I think you're in the wrong pod." "I know. I was just trying to run a diagnostic on the neural interface system." "I didn't mean to." The pod lurched violently as it detached from the orbital station. Through the viewport, Avery watched in disbelief as Earth grew smaller. They were heading toward Epsilon 7, a contested moon where the Kresh Empire had established a foothold. The battle had been raging for 3 weeks. "Can we turn back?" Avery asked, her voice cracking. James checked his tactical display and shook his head. "Once combat deployment is initiated, there's no recall. Protocol assumes any return signal could be enemy interference. We're locked in for the duration." Avery sank against the pod's wall, her mind racing. She was a neural interface engineer, not a soldier. She'd spent the last 5 years designing the synaptic bridges that allowed human pilots to interface with their combat mechs. She'd never even fired a weapon. The 23 soldiers around her began their pre-battle rituals, checking weapons, reviewing tactical data, some praying quietly. Avery noticed they were carrying several sealed containers marked with biohazard symbols. "What are those?" she asked James. "Kresh bioweapons," he replied grimly. "Intelligence says they're planning to deploy them on civilian colonies. Our mission is to infiltrate their command center and steal their deployment codes. If we can't steal them, we destroy the facility." He paused, studying her face. "Look, when we land, you stay in the pod. Lock yourself in the cockpit. We'll be back in 6 hours, maybe 8. But fate had other plans. The Kresh had upgraded their orbital defenses. As the transport pod entered Epsilon 7's atmosphere, enemy fire tore through its port side. Alarms shrieked as the pod spiraled out of control. James grabbed Avery and shoved her into a crash harness seconds before impact. The world became a nightmare of screaming metal and fire. When the smoke cleared, Avery found herself in a crater surrounded by twisted debris. Of the 24 soldiers, only 7 had survived the crash, and James wasn't among the conscious. He lay pinned under a support beam, blood seeping from a head wound. "Sergeant." Avery crawled to him, her hands shaking as she checked his pulse. "Alive, but barely." "Ma'am, we need to move." One of the soldiers, a young corporal named Davis, hauled her to her feet. "Kresh ground forces will be here in minutes." "We can't leave him. We have to complete the mission," Davis insisted. "Those bioweapon codes." An explosion cut him off. Kresh walkers emerged from the tree-line, 12-foot-tall mechanized suits bristling with weapons. The remaining soldiers opened fire, but they were hopelessly outgunned. Avery's engineer mind kicked into overdrive. The crashed pod's neural interface core was still intact. She could see its signature on her wrist display. And scattered around the crater were 3 damaged human combat mechs that had been in the pod's cargo hold. "Cover me," she shouted, sprinting toward the nearest mech. "What are you doing?" Davis yelled. Avery didn't answer. She couldn't explain that she'd spent 5 years building the very system that made these mechs work. She'd tested every iteration, debugged every neural pathway, but always in simulation, never in actual combat. She climbed into the mech's cockpit and activated the neural bridge. Pain lanced through her skull as the interface connected, but she pushed through it. The mech's systems were damaged, weapons offline, armor compromised, one leg barely functional. But the neural link was intact, and Avery knew something nobody else did. She'd built a backdoor into every mech she'd designed. As the Kresh walkers advanced, Avery accessed the mech's core programming and bypassed every safety limit. She overclocked the reactor, rerouted power from life support to the servos, and activated a neural feedback mode that was supposed to be impossible, direct sensory integration. Suddenly, she didn't just control the mech. She was the mech. The sensation was overwhelming. She could feel every damaged circuit like a bruise, every servo movement like her own muscles. When a Kresh plasma bolt struck her armor, she felt it as burning pain across her chest. But she also felt something else: power. Raw, limitless power. Avery charged. The Kresh had never fought anything like her. Their walkers were piloted through conventional controls, mechanical, predictable. Avery moved with human intuition and machine strength. She dodged incoming fire with reflexes no standard mech could match, closed the distance in seconds, and tore into the enemy with damaged arms that shouldn't have been able to function. It shouldn't have worked. Every combat manual said a single damaged mech couldn't defeat 12 walkers. But combat manuals didn't account for human desperation, genius-level engineering knowledge, and a neural interface pushed far beyond its design limits. 10 minutes later, 12 Kresh walkers lay in smoking ruins. Avery collapsed out of the mech, blood streaming from her nose, her body trembling from neural feedback overload. Davis and the surviving soldiers stared at her in shock. How? Davis began. Later, Avery gasped. "We need to get James and complete the mission." They did. Using intel from the destroyed walkers, they located the Kresh command center. Avery, still reeling from the neural feedback, jury-rigged a signal jammer from mech components that let them infiltrate undetected. They retrieved the bioweapon deployment codes and called for extraction. When they returned to the orbital station 3 days later, Avery was immediately rushed to medical. She'd suffered severe neural trauma from the feedback overload. Doctors said she'd never be able to use a neural interface again. James, recovering in the bed next to hers, laughed when he heard that. "Good. You belong in a lab anyway." But the military had other ideas. 2 weeks later, Admiral Zhang herself visited Avery's hospital room. "The Kresh have withdrawn from 3 sectors after seeing footage of your engagement," the admiral said. "They think we've developed some kind of super soldier program." She held out a small box. "The Stellar Cross, for extraordinary valor in combat. You saved 7 soldiers, prevented a bioweapon deployment, and single-handedly turned the tide of the Epsilon 7 campaign." Avery accepted the medal with trembling hands. "I just pressed the wrong button." James, watching from his bed, grinned. "Best wrong button ever pressed."